So, I needed a truck. Something that could reliably take me and my surfing, diving, and fishing gear just about anywhere on the Pacific coast. I wanted the body to look good and stand up to my abuse as long as the engine would. In this video, I'll share with you how I researched, prepared, and applied Raptor liner to my Nissan Frontier to achieve a great-looking, durable, DIY-friendly paint job on a reasonable budget. Let's go. Somewhat recently, I was getting ready for a kayak fishing trip on the Sea of Cortez in Baja. A hurricane had just gone through and washed out all of the roads, pretty much making 4x4 mandatory. I'd been driving a single cab, two-wheel drive Tacoma for getting up on a decade, and it seemed as good a time as any to upgrade. So my first car was an '88 Jeep Cherokee, and while I commend it for standing up to my almost relentless efforts to destroy it, I was also a little turned off on American vehicles after spending a lot of time repairing the engine, transmission, and cooling system. Ultimately, I wanted something that was going to be kind of budget-friendly because I did plan on subjecting it to a lot of abuse. Also, a crew cab with enough room to put all my gear in on a camping trip and still have plenty of room in the bed to sleep under a camper shell. After a few months of researching and then watching Craigslist and car gurus, I found a 2004 Nissan Frontier and a manual transmission that fit the bill perfectly and would run me a fraction of the cost of a Tacoma. Not only was the paint job peeling on the truck when I got it, but matching that paint job with a camper shell would have required me to most likely buy new, which would have set me back another couple grand, and then I would have been matching to a paint job that was already in disrepair anyway. That set me down the path of repainting both to match, which led me to this popular phenomenon online of people who are just covering their entire vehicles in bed liner material. So let's talk about the project cost, both in terms of time and money. One of the better vloggers I could find on the subject actually did an amazing job, but I feel like he kind of misrepresented the cost itself. Here's 2 kits worth of cost, and oh, by the way, my friends who run this professional paint shop did everything else for me. I just feel like that doesn't accurately represent how much goes into this, and I wanted to make sure I give a clear picture on that. So first up, the Raptor liner kit itself is easily the biggest cost portion of all of this. A 1-gallon kit is spec'd to cover about 125 square feet. My truck is roughly 240, so that's 2 kits worth right there, plus the camper shell. We ended up going for 3 kits. Based on the manufacturer's recommendation, we ended up going with an epoxy-based primer. This was about $200 or roughly 20% of our budget, and we definitely could have gone without, but we wanted to be extra careful and make sure we fully covered the paint job itself so that it didn't peek through. I live in Los Angeles, so we ended up having to go with a spray booth to work in. That cost us about $200 for a 6-hour session. I think without all of the priming, we probably could have gotten away with just a 3-hour session and been fine. Another component a lot of people don't cover are the little things like prep materials and safety. They don't cost a lot, but there are a lot of them, so they tend to add up pretty quickly. 2 rolls of automotive masking tape, cans of wax and grease removal for the final cleanup, Tyvek suits, respirators in a pandemic, acetone for cleaning up the spray guns, little cups for measuring. All of these things added up, and we're probably about 10% of our budget in all. Moving on from monetary budget, there's also the time budget to consider. I gave myself about 3 full days to make sure I wasn't feeling rushed or stressed or behind, especially since I had scheduled with a deposit on a spray booth. I handled pretty much the majority of the prep myself, but you could definitely say that I'm handy in the sense that I've, built or renovated fully 3 different houses, worked on a lot of cars myself, though I would say I'm remedial at best when it comes to paint prep and actual painting. At any given point throughout this, I probably over-budgeted by about 30 to 50% on how much time I actually needed to get this done. Again, because we were scheduled with a deposit, I wanted to make sure I was never feeling behind so much as just on time, if not with a little bit of room to spare. And I think we did a pretty good job of that. We booked our spray booth for 6 hours, and it started at 11 and went until the end of the day. The parking lot opened up at 7:30 in the morning, so then we had another 3 hours to kind of work on the masking and cleanup before then. Having a full day to work on this was pretty great, actually. I would say definitely give yourself a good, healthy buffer of time. Okay, now that I've gone over cost, I want to cover the process in its entirety. That involves scuffing, cleaning, masking, priming, and painting. The purpose of scuffing up the entire vehicle is to ensure that the paint will adhere properly. The existing paint job doesn't need to be fully removed so much as just kind of roughed up a little bit. Tools for this job included an orbital sander with 180 to 220 grit sandpaper per the manufacturer recommendation. I also used a bunch of little wire and nylon brushes. I would say, in retrospect, the king of all tools for this job was the nylon cup brush that attaches to a drill or an angle grinder. They really did an amazing job of kind of getting into little crevices and going over uneven surfaces. Sandpaper is kind of a pain because you're throwing away all of these sheets as they gunk up or cleaning them as they gunk up, and they just weren't as consistent as a nylon brush was, which seemed to really do a great job of just getting everything nice and scuffed really quickly. After sanding, I took the truck to a pretty standard coin wash. Just made sure I did like a deep grease scrub to get off all the dust and any other residue that's already on the truck. There's one other aspect of the cleaning that we'll do right before we end up priming and painting, and that's using a wax and grease remover. It's kind of an aerosol spray solvent that you spray on and wipe off to remove, well, pretty much any wax and grease that would keep the paint from sticking to the body. Next is masking. Because you can't drive the truck to the spray booth with construction paper over the windows, we basically did all of the fine line taping at home before so that we could tape everything to that tape there on the spot. We also ended up taking off all the headlights and tail lights, as well as fender guards. We also removed the bumper roof racks as well. Priming was really straightforward. We ended up using an HVLP gravity-fed gun at the manufacturer recommended PSI to just kind of coat the entire truck. It was also manufacturer recommended via the technical sheet that you can spray the Raptor liner on after a 30-minute flash dry, so it was technically a wet-on-wet coat. Up next is painting, letting that coat flash, and painting again. Raptor liner comes with its own gun, and there is a broad array of opinions on what PSI and distance from which to shoot for different textures and coats. The general rule of thumb is higher PSI and further away means you're going to get a much finer, almost like sandpaper kind of consistency, and the closer you are with a much lower PSI is going to ensure it's much gloppier and kind of smoother in texture. I was lucky enough to meet a guy who does this for a living out of this very spray booth, and he advised me to go with 70 PSI and to shoot from about 2 feet away. Ultimately, when we tried it ourselves, that was exactly what we wanted in result, so we went pretty much to the letter with his recommendation. I've seen other people recommend anywhere from 60 to 80 PSI, but generally speaking, people really like to go above the manufacturer recommendation of, like, I think it's something like 30 to 50 PSI. This more in the post-mortem, but you definitely want to do at least 2 coats. And as you get closer to whatever your final coat is, you want to make sure you have a nice, even, consistent spray. If you're kind of touching up spots, it tends to glop and leave shiny and dull contrasts. The more you kind of powder coat toward the end, the more it comes out really nice and matte and consistent. Beyond that, standard spray painting best practices apply. You never really want to arc the gun as you spray. You want to work really hard to kind of spray flat. In addition to that, you want to make sure you're kind of letting go of the trigger as you finish a pass so that it doesn't pool up anywhere. The other thing I read a lot of when I was getting advice on how to spray is making sure you're getting like a 50% overlap as you're moving along with your passes, and even going back in like a plaid pattern with each subsequent coat. Like, so if you're going this way for one coat, you go that way for the other, so you don't get these striped effects. Raptor liner can be recoated after just 1 hour, so that gives you just enough time to go down to the taco truck and get a nice refreshing drink in between. One of the most important tools you'll have access to at a spray booth is the air compressor itself. This ensures that at your regulator, you're maintaining that PSI and your paint is going on consistently. If you're not working out of a spray booth or a professional shop with a big compressor, I do recommend getting access to something bigger than a 3 to 5 gallon one, just because the consistency is really key there. Okay, this is the post-mortem, all of the do's and don'ts of the project. First one, do have a plan. Make sure you walk through everything beforehand and write it all down. Order all of your materials well in advance. Order more materials than you think you're going to need, because the last thing you want to do is run out while working on the project. We over-ordered on just about everything, and I'm really glad we did. Do not skimp on the protective gear. You want a respirator, gloves, Tyvek suit, and goggles. You do not want this stuff in your skin or eyes, and it's pretty nasty to breathe. Don't be afraid to ask people for help. I cannot stress that enough. The people who work in all of the automotive paint shops were really awesome to me throughout this entire process. The people I spoke with at U-Pole in customer service, the company that owns Raptor liner, they gave me really useful and helpful advice. The company OEM, the spray booth and paint shop where I ended up doing all the work, huge shout out to Peter, the guy who runs that shop. He answered countless questions for me throughout the week leading up to and during the process. I probably couldn't have gotten this done if I hadn't really been picking the brains of people who see this kind of stuff every day. So by all means, use the people around you who do this on a regular basis, because everybody I encountered was super happy to talk about this stuff at great length. Do test spray before you get going on the vehicle itself. When we were in the spray booth, you can just spray on the walls, so we just kind of picked a spot and tested a few different times to see what we liked texture-wise, but highly recommended to use a test panel before you get going on the vehicle itself. Do have a partner for spraying. Each bottle of Raptor liner is a 2-part mixture with a hardener, and we went through, 12 different liters, and every time you run out of a liter, you have to shake it for 2 minutes. So you kind of work in tandem with somebody while you're doing this. Otherwise, there's a whole lot of waiting around and lost time. Being the awesome husband that I am, I put my wife on spray duty and did all the shaking for the most part. You're also going to want somebody to help clear the hose for you as you're walking around spraying. You don't want the hose to rub up against the vehicle, especially where it's wet, and it tends to get caught behind the tires as you're working your way around. Having a buddy, could not recommend that one enough. I would say it's almost mandatory. Do make your final coat as consistent and thin as possible. I cannot stress this one enough. When we started the final coat, I did the roof very much like almost like a dust layer on top, and it came out nice and matte, but we were like spot checking a bunch of side panels and doors, and it got really gloppy and inconsistent toward the end there. We actually were going back into the booth to do the camper shell separately, and ended up like doing a second final coat over the sides of the truck just because we were so unhappy with how it looked at the time. Do match the Raptor liner to your paint job, or get a primer that matches the Raptor liner color. When we were speaking with U-Pole's customer service, they recommended we use like a light gray as a contrast for our primer so that we could see if we were missing any spots. The unfortunate thing was we couldn't see when we were missing spots until after it had cured and dried and we washed it off. There were some spots that were just little stippling down in there that showed through. If we had done a black primer, I think we would have been just as well off. But the other thing is, like, when you're doing it on the cheap like this, you tend to not scuff and paint the door jambs and the doors themselves, because you have to take the paneling off the doors and mask the entire interior, and it's a lot more work than we wanted to do. So we have a bit of a two-tone color there. We have red on the door jambs and doors, and then even like a little bit of a primer gradient out to black. I've seen people do it where they match the original paint color with their Raptor liner, and you don't get that. Now, we don't mind because it's kind of a beater truck anyway, but it definitely is a lot nicer if you can have a consistent color throughout. But above all, I do very highly recommend matching your final paint color with your primer so that if any is sneaking through in the end, you're not upset by that. On the subject of missed spots, do make sure you are spraying perpendicular to whatever surface you're working on as much as possible. That can get kind of tricky around doors and windows and hard angles where like the roof meets the door. Those are ones where you definitely want to have a ladder or a scaffold handy because you really want to be able to get up and away from those to get the proper angle. Otherwise, you end up with these little stipplings where it's sprayed across the surface. Finally, do not let anyone tell you that this isn't an awesome and viable project. I spoke with a couple of representatives from companies like Bullet Liner and Line-X, and these are bed liners that are kind of done in a proprietary fashion at a high temperature, very thinly sprayed on in multiple coats in a specialized setting. First of all, they were quoting me more than I paid for my truck to paint it with what is a relatively similar product. Every single one of them told me that it was going to be brittle and ugly and it wasn't going to last. And literally everything I've seen 2, 3, 4 years down the road from people who've done this before, it seems to hold up pretty amazing. Despite what those people had to say, I could not be happier with the way this turned out. And with that, I'm kind of thrilled to show you all the fancy footage of the finished product. So let's get into that.